In 2016, a celebrated therapist and his architect husband adopted an 8-year-old black child from foster care, an act hailed as a triumph of compassion. They created a picture-perfect family in their stunning hillside home. But when the boy vanished, they told a convincing story of a troubled child running away to find his drug-addicted birth mother. For a year, the lie held. Then, a once-in-a-generation storm tore the earth apart, exposing a shallow grave behind their home with the boy's skeleton still inside. Before I begin, thank you for being here. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what this story brings up for you. It's important to know we're in this together, trying to make sense of the darkness. Now, let me tell you what really happened. For 15 years, social worker Eliza M. Vance had existed in a world of broken systems and managed decline. Her signature was the final act, the full stop at the end of long, bureaucratic sentences that sealed the fates of children too often forgotten. The tired, looping scrawl of her name on countless files usually felt more like a brand than a blessing, a mark of her complicity in it all. But not today. As she pressed the cheap ballpoint pen to this final adoption decree, the act felt different. Today, her signature felt like a benediction. She looked across the polished expanse of the conference table at the file resting beside her hand. It was thick, heavy with the accumulated weight of a short, hard life. Jordan M. D.O.B. March 14th, 2008. Inside were the reports of neglect, the clinical assessments of trauma, the blurred photo of a 7-year-old with eyes that seemed to hold the weary resignation of an old man. Jordan was one of her kids, one of the ones who haunted the drive home, whose file she'd find herself rereading late at night, a cold cup of coffee forgotten at her elbow. He was a child who had never been given a chance to be a child, bounced between 3 foster homes in 4 years, each one chipping away another piece of him, leaving him quiet, watchful, and coiled as tight as a spring. Then the Clarks had appeared, like an answer to a prayer Eliza had long forgotten how to say. David and Michael Clark. They were a golden couple, the kind of people who seemed to exist on a slightly different plane from the rest of humanity. When they had first walked into her drab, government-issue office, they had filled the space with an aura of calm, expensive confidence. David, the architect, was the quiet one, his observations sharp, his presence grounded. Michael, the therapist, was the talker, his voice a warm, reassuring melody. He spoke the language of healing, using words like attachment, resilience, and trauma-informed care with an easy fluency that had both impressed Eliza and put her on her guard. She'd met plenty of well-meaning people who had read all the books but folded at the first sign of a real, messy, wounded child. But the Clarks were different. Their file was pristine, their references impeccable. They lived in a sprawling, minimalist house in the city's most exclusive hillside enclave, a place of clean lines, glass walls, and breathtaking views. David had designed it himself. During the home study, Eliza had walked through its pristine, gallery-like rooms, feeling clumsy and out of place. Everything was white, or gray, or the warm, unassuming beige of natural wood. It was a house that seemed to have no tolerance for clutter, for noise, for the chaotic energy of a little boy. "We know it's a lot," Michael had said, sensing her thoughts as he handed her a glass of cucumber-infused water. "But we see it as a canvas, a quiet, stable place for him to finally feel safe, to finally breathe." They had wanted Jordan specifically. They hadn't shied away from his file. They had read about the night terrors, the hoarding of food, the sudden, volcanic outbursts of frustration. "That's not damage, Eliza," Michael had insisted, his gaze earnest and unwavering. "That's a roadmap. It shows us where the hurt is. It shows us where to begin the work." And so, against her own ingrained cynicism, Eliza had allowed herself to hope. She had championed their application, pushed it through the system, and defended her decision to skeptical supervisors who saw only the potential for a culture clash, a collision between a boy from the hard edges of life and a couple who had never known anything but privilege. The placement day a month ago had been a study in quiet tension. Jordan had stood in the center of that vast, white living room, clutching the worn backpack that held all his worldly possessions. He was a small, dark figure in a sea of pale perfection, his eyes wide as he took in the floor-to-ceiling windows and the city sprawled out below like a map. David had knelt, not crowding him, and pointed to a specific spot on the far wall. "See that space?" he'd said, his voice soft. "That's for you. We can put up your drawings there. Anything you want. We'll get a big corkboard. We can even paint it your favorite color." Jordan had just stared, silent. It was Michael who had bridged the gap, sitting on the floor a few feet away, not touching, just being present. He'd started talking about his own childhood, a funny story about a hamster that had escaped its cage, and slowly, cautiously, Jordan had sat down too, his small body still rigid with uncertainty. By the time Eliza had left that day, Jordan had accepted a glass of apple juice and was watching as David sketched out a design for the corkboard on a piece of paper. It was a fragile beginning, but it was a beginning. Now, signing the final adoption decree, Eliza felt a wave of relief so profound it almost made her dizzy. She had done it. She had taken one of her kids, one of the lost ones, and delivered him into a world of safety, wealth, and therapeutic expertise. She had given him the best possible chance. She closed the file, the thick cardboard cover making a soft, final thud. Outside her window, the city was beginning to light up as dusk settled, a million little promises flickering in the twilight. For the first time in a long time, Eliza Vance allowed herself to believe that some promises could actually be kept. She pictured Jordan in that beautiful house on the hill, finally learning to unclench his fists, finally learning to breathe. She saw him laughing, his artwork tacked to the wall, the ghost of his past finally starting to recede. It was a perfect image, a flawless composition of hope and redemption. And as she packed her briefcase and headed out into the evening, she held that image in her mind like a precious, fragile thing, completely unaware that it was nothing more than a beautiful, expertly crafted lie. The house on the hill was not a sanctuary. It was a stage, and the final act was about to begin. The performance of compassion lasted less than a month. Behind the glass walls and the facade of healing, the house became a laboratory for cruelty. Jordan's trauma, the very thing they had claimed they could heal, became their private theater. They were not healers. They were predators who had adopted a wounded animal for the sport of tormenting it. The night terrors were the first frontier. When Jordan woke screaming, Michael would no longer speak of the amygdala. Instead, he and David would enter the room together, their faces illuminated from below by a single flashlight, their expressions cold and curious. They would stand over his bed in the dark, watching him sob, analyzing his fear like a scientific specimen. "Fascinating," Michael once whispered to David, as Jordan trembled under his thin duvet. "The physiological response is so pure. Unfiltered terror." Their therapy sessions became rituals of quiet sadism. They discovered Jordan was terrified of the dark, cavernous basement, a space David had converted into a minimalist home gym with a single, harsh overhead light. When Jordan had an emotional outburst, a predictable, frustrated cry from a child overwhelmed by his new, sterile environment, they would call it a containment session. "We need to provide you with a secure space to process these big feelings," Michael would say, his voice a parody of therapeutic calm. Then he and David would lead the boy down the concrete stairs, his small hand engulfed in David's firm grip. They would make him sit in the center of the cold floor, directly under the glare of the single light, and leave him there in the echoing silence. Sometimes for 10 minutes, sometimes for an hour. They would watch him on a security camera feed they had routed to David's office, a small, dark figure huddled in a vast, empty space. The quiet pleasure they took in his fear was a shared, unspoken bond between them. It was their secret, their true intimacy. The hoarding of food became another game. Instead of treating it with understanding, they began to use it as a tool of humiliation. Once a week, they would conduct a search of his room, pulling out his pathetic, hidden treasures, a half-eaten apple, a stale crust of bread wrapped in a napkin. They would lay them out on his perfectly made bed. "This is a violation of the household's integrity, Jordan," David would say, his voice flat and disappointed. "This behavior demonstrates a profound lack of trust," Michael would add, circling the display. And a lack of trust must have consequences. No dessert this week. We need to help you understand the cause and effect of your choices. They weren't teaching him. They were enjoying his shame, his powerlessness. The breaking point was not a sudden, violent snap. It was a deliberate escalation. It was a Tuesday night. Jordan, exhausted and emotionally frayed, had another night terror. This one was worse than usual. He woke up screaming and couldn't be calmed. His sobs were loud, raw, and inconsolable, a sound of pure, animal grief that echoed through the pristine, silent house. For David, the noise was an intolerable intrusion, a stain on the perfect quiet of his sanctuary. For Michael, it was a personal failure, a galling reminder that this child, this project was not responding to his expert methods. The boy's authentic pain was an insult to his professional pride. "This can't continue," David said, his jaw tight. Michael's eyes had a cold, determined glint. "It won't. It's time for a more intensive intervention." They dragged the sobbing, terrified child from his bed. Jordan clawed at the doorframe as they pulled him into the hallway. "No, please, not the basement," he shrieked. His pleas only seemed to fuel their resolve. This was the ultimate test of their control. They took him downstairs, the sound of his cries swallowed by the thick concrete walls. This time, they didn't leave him alone. "You are going to learn to control yourself," Michael hissed, his face inches from Jordan's, the mask of the therapist gone completely, revealing the snarling narcissist beneath. He grabbed Jordan by the shoulders, shaking him. "You will be quiet." Jordan, hysterical with fear, thrashed in his grip. David moved in, his movements economical and precise, to help restrain him. It was no longer about therapy or containment. It was about dominance. It was about breaking him. In the struggle, as they forced the thrashing boy to the floor, Michael's grip slipped. Jordan's head, propelled by the momentum of their own violent actions, slammed backward against the exposed metal base of a weight bench. There was a sickening, wet crack, and then silence. A perfect, absolute silence. Jordan lay limp on the cold floor. The ugly, raw sound of his grief was gone. The problem had been solved. For a long moment, they just stood there, breathing heavily, looking down at the small, still body. There was no panic in their eyes. Not yet. There was only a flicker of surprise, the look of two men who had been enjoying a cruel game and had accidentally, carelessly, broken their toy. It was David who spoke first, his voice a low, practical whisper. "Well," he said, looking at the body with the dispassionate eye of an architect assessing a structural flaw. "That's a complication." The cold, calculated part of their minds took over instantly. The thrill of the abuse was replaced by the urgent need for self-preservation. Michael looked at David, his mind already spinning the narrative, crafting the lie. His birth mother, Michael said, the story falling into place with practiced ease. He ran away. David nodded slowly, his gaze moving from Jordan's body to the empty space on the floor. "Yes," he agreed. "He was always so unstable." They left him on the basement floor and went upstairs. In the pristine, silent kitchen, they poured themselves 2 glasses of expensive whiskey, their hands perfectly steady. They were not grieving fathers. They were predators, calmly planning how to hide the carcass of their prey. The phone call came at 9:17 a.m. on a Wednesday morning. Eliza was at her desk, trying to wrestle a jam printer while simultaneously fielding a call from an irate foster mother. The air in the office was its usual mix of stale coffee, disinfectant, and quiet desperation. When her desk phone rang with its shrill, insistent chirp, she almost ignored it. But the caller ID flashed a name that made her pause. Clark Michael. She picked up the receiver, a sense of professional obligation warring with a flicker of annoyance. Eliza Vance. Eliza. The voice on the other end was a wreck. It was Michael Clark, but a version of him she had never heard before. His usual warm, confident baritone was gone, replaced by a ragged, broken whisper. "Eliza, thank God. Something terrible has happened." Eliza's posture straightened. The jammed printer, the angry foster mom, it all faded away. "Michael? What is it? What's wrong? Is it Jordan?" A sound that might have been a sob crackled down the line. "He's gone, Eliza." He's gone. Gone? What do you mean gone? A cold knot formed in her stomach. Did he run away? Yes. No. It's his mother. His birth mother. Michael's voice was a torrent of panicked, disjointed words. He told the story of a woman appearing at their gate the previous afternoon, strung out, demanding to see her son. He spoke of a confrontation, of Jordan being confused and conflicted. He said they had managed to get the woman to leave, but that Jordan had been deeply unsettled all evening. And then, this morning, he was just gone. His bed was empty. A window in the kitchen was unlocked. A half-eaten granola bar, the kind they kept for him, was on the counter. We think he went to her, Eliza, Michael choked out. We think he ran away to find her. We've called the police, of course. They're on their way. But my God, she's not stable. He could be anywhere. Eliza listened, her knuckles white on the receiver. Every instinct she had, honed by 15 years of navigating lies, half-truths, and desperate fabrications, was screaming. The story was too neat, too tidy. It was a perfect, self-contained narrative of tragedy, one that conveniently explained the disappearance of a troubled child. It was a story that a therapist, a professional storyteller of human behavior, would craft. Michael, she said, keeping her voice steady, professional. I need you to be very clear. You're certain he wasn't taken? We don't know, he cried, his performance flawless. The police will figure that out. We looked in his room. He'd packed a small bag, a few toys, a t-shirt. It looks like he left on his own. Oh God, this is our fault. We should have seen how much he was struggling. The self-blame was the masterstroke. It deflected suspicion, transforming them from potential suspects into grieving, guilt-ridden parents. Eliza felt a wave of nausea. I'm on my way, she said, her voice colder than she intended. The scene at the house was one of controlled chaos. 2 police officers were in the kitchen, their presence large and incongruous in the pristine space. David Clark stood by the window, his back to the room, a statue of silent grief. Michael was at the table, his head in his hands, being questioned by a detective. He looked up as Eliza entered, his eyes red-rimmed and pleading. He looked, for all the world, like a heartbroken father. Eliza's focus wasn't on them. It was on the details. The unlocked window. The half-eaten granola bar on the counter, looking less like a clue and more like a prop. It all felt staged. She asked the detective, a weary-looking man named Miller, if she could see Jordan's room. The room was neat. Too neat for a child who had supposedly packed in a hurry and fled in the middle of the night. A small dinosaur backpack was on the bed. Inside, as Michael had said, were a few toys and a neatly folded t-shirt. It didn't look like the desperate act of a runaway child. It looked like evidence, carefully arranged. His birth mother's name is Charisse Powell, Eliza told Detective Miller back in the kitchen, her voice tight. She has no fixed address, no phone. Her last known location was a shelter downtown, but she hasn't been there in 6 months. She has no car, no resources. The idea that she could find this house, all the way up here, and orchestrate this, it's highly improbable. Miller sighed, running a hand over his face. He looked from Eliza to the grieving couple. Ms. Vance, with all due respect, we're hearing from the boys' fathers that he talked about her constantly, that he was obsessed with finding her. Kids are resourceful, and the mother, well, a mother's instinct is a powerful thing. And a history of severe drug abuse and neglect is also a powerful thing, Eliza countered, her voice rising. She never once tried to make contact while he was in the system. Not once. Why now? Why here? Maybe she got clean. Maybe she felt guilty. Miller shrugged, his gaze drifting back to Michael, who was now being comforted by a distraught-looking David. Look, these are good people. They gave this kid a palace. Sometimes, you can give a kid everything, and they still just want to go back to what they know, even if it's hell. It was a brick wall, a wall built of class, status, and the sheer, unshakable confidence of the Clarks. They were wealthy, educated, and well-regarded. They were credible witnesses to their own tragedy. Eliza was just a tired, cynical social worker. She took her concerns to her supervisor, a man named Henderson whose primary skill was avoiding paperwork. He listened to her with a pained expression, his fingers steepled under his chin. Eliza, he said when she had finished. "I understand your professional skepticism, but we have to be careful here. The Clarks are a prominent family. Michael Clark has served on 3 of the city's nonprofit boards. To even suggest they are anything other than victims, and this would be a massive overstep. I'm not suggesting, I'm questioning," she insisted. "The story doesn't add up. I knew that boy, Henderson. He was scared. He was a survivor. He wouldn't have run to an unknown danger. He would have run from one. And perhaps he was running from the trauma of his past, a trauma that even this ideal environment couldn't heal," Henderson said, his voice taking on a placating, patronizing tone. Michael Clark himself said they were worried about Jordan's inability to form secure attachments. This is tragically consistent with his psychological profile. He was using their own narrative against her. The very diagnosis Michael had created to control Jordan was now being used to explain his disappearance. It was a perfect closed loop of logic. The case was officially closed within a week. Jordan was listed as a runaway, a likely victim of parental abduction by a transient birth mother. A statewide alert was issued, a formality that Eliza knew would lead nowhere. The system had accepted the story. The lie had been ratified. Eliza sat in her office, the flimsy file for Jordan, now stamped with the red, final letters, "Case closed." She felt a profound sense of failure, a cold, heavy certainty that she had delivered that child not to a sanctuary, but to an abattoir. She had signed the papers. She had vouched for them. She had been the one who had walked him through their front door and left him there. The image of the perfect home on the hill, once a symbol of hope, now curdled in her mind. It was a tomb, a pristine, beautifully designed, and expertly guarded tomb. And she, Eliza Vance, had just helped them seal the door. She placed Jordan's file into the bottom drawer of her cabinet, but she knew it wouldn't stay there. This wasn't over. For the system, the case was closed. For her, it had just begun. The year that followed was a year of silence. To the world, the tragic story of Jordan Clark faded as all stories do, replaced by new headlines, new dramas. The compassionate, heartbroken couple on the hill became a local cautionary tale, a symbol of how even the best intentions could be shattered by the intractable nature of childhood trauma. They were objects of pity and sympathy. They hosted small, somber gatherings. Michael took a sabbatical from his practice to heal. David's firm won the museum contract, and he threw himself into his work. Life, for the Clarks, went on with a quiet, dignified grief that was as beautifully performed as everything else in their lives. For Eliza, the silence was a living thing. It was a constant, humming presence in the back of her mind, a low-grade fever that never broke. She did her job. She managed her cases, signed her papers, and drank her lukewarm coffee. But she was living a double life. By day, she was Eliza Vance, overworked social worker. By night, she was the sole keeper of Jordan's memory, the only person on earth who believed he had been murdered. Her vigil began with a file. Not the official one, stamped and buried in the archives, but a new one. A plain manila folder she bought herself. On the tab, she wrote a single word, Jordan. Inside, she placed her own notes from a case, her timeline of the adoption, and a detailed, minute-by-minute account of the day he was reported missing, highlighting every inconsistency, every word that had rung false. This file became her obsession. It lived not in her office, but in a locked drawer in her small apartment, a secret testament to a crime no one else believed had happened. She spent her evenings falling down rabbit holes on the internet. She ran dozens of searches for Charisse Powell, Jordan's birth mother, cross-referencing her name with shelter databases, hospital admissions, and arrest records across 3 states. She found nothing. The woman had vanished from the face of the earth years ago, a ghost long before the Clarks had ever needed to invoke her. Each dead end was another small, bitter confirmation of the lie. A real, living person would have left a trace. A phantom, a convenient scapegoat, left none. Guilt was her constant companion. It sat on her chest when she woke in the mornings and tucked her into a restless sleep at night. She saw Jordan's face in other children at the supermarket, on the playground. She saw his wide, watchful eyes, the way he held his body as if expecting a blow. She replayed every interaction she'd had with the Clarks, dissecting every word, every gesture, searching for the clue she must have missed. Had Michael's smile been too practiced? Had David's silence been a sign of something other than shyness? She had been so desperate to believe in a happy ending that she had ignored the red flags that her own instincts, in retrospect, had been frantically waving. She had seen their perfect house and their perfect lives and had mistaken it for goodness. She had sold a child for a beautiful story. Once a month, she would make her pilgrimage. She would get in her car on a Sunday afternoon and drive up into the hills, into the quiet, wealthy enclave where the Clarks lived. She never stopped. She would just drive slowly past their house, her hands tight on the steering wheel. The house was as pristine as ever. The landscaping was immaculate. And in the spot at the edge of the property, the spot that overlooked the steep, wooded ravine, a Japanese maple tree was now growing. She had watched it get planted. A few weeks after Jordan's disappearance, a landscaping truck had been parked outside. She'd seen them, David and Michael, directing the workmen. She'd watched as the young, elegant tree was lowered into the ground. It was a memorial, the neighbors probably thought. A beautiful, living tribute to the boy they had lost. Eliza knew what it really was. It was a marker, a gravestone. She watched that tree through the seasons. She saw its delicate leaves turn from green to a fiery, blood red in the autumn. She saw its bare, skeletal branches dusted with a rare winter frost. She saw it bud again in the spring, a vibrant symbol of life growing out of a place of death. The sight of it made her physically ill. It was an act of breathtaking arrogance, a daily, silent taunt. They had not just hidden their crime, they had decorated it. One evening in late summer, almost a year after Jordan had vanished, she drove by and saw them hosting a party. The glass walls of the house glowed with warm light. Figures moved inside, laughing, holding wine glasses. Music drifted out into the warm, still air. Eliza pulled her car over to the curb 100 yards down the road, her heart pounding with a cold, helpless rage. She could see them on their deck, David, leaning against the railing, looking relaxed, and Michael, circulating among his guests, his arm thrown casually over a friend's shoulder, his face animated as he told a story. They were the picture of resilience, two men who had endured a tragedy and emerged, wounded but whole, on the other side. She sat there for nearly an hour, watching the charade, the weight of her secret pressing down on her. She was a ghost at their feast, an invisible witness to their monstrous success. The world saw two grieving fathers. She saw two murderers standing on the grave of their son, drinking wine. As she finally put the car in gear and drove away, a single, hard resolve settled in her soul. She didn't know how, and she didn't know when, but she knew, with an absolute certainty, that one day, the earth would give up its dead, and she would be there, waiting. The storm arrived without fanfare, an anomaly in a season of placid, blue skies. It began as a whisper of wind, a strange, greenish tint to the horizon. By late afternoon, it had become a roar. It was a storm of biblical proportions, a once-in-a-generation weather event that clawed at the city with a savage, personal fury. Rain didn't fall. It came down in solid, blinding sheets, turning roads into rivers and overwhelming the city's aging drainage systems. Eliza was at home, listening to the wind howl around the corners of her apartment building. The lights flickered, then died, plunging her into a sudden, disorienting darkness. She sat by the window, watching the storm, a strange, electric feeling in the air that had nothing to do with the lightning that split the sky. She thought of the house on the hill. The hillsides, already saturated from a wet summer, would be vulnerable. The soil would be loosening, the foundations of things shifting. The thought was a prayer, a dark and terrible hope that she barely dared to acknowledge. The news began to trickle in the next morning. Reports of flash floods, downed trees, and power outages across the city. And then, on the midday news, a reporter stood, rain slicker glistening, in a familiar, upscale neighborhood. Behind her, a scene of muddy devastation. The camera panned across a hillside that had simply given way, a great, raw, brown scar where manicured lawns and terrace gardens had been only yesterday. A landslide. The damage has been most severe here on Crestview Drive, the reporter said, her voice competing with the sound of generators. Several homes have sustained significant property damage, though miraculously, no residents have been injured. Eliza leaned toward the television, her heart hammering against her ribs. Crestview Drive. She knew the name. She knew the curve of that street, the look of those houses. The camera zoomed in on one property in particular. The back of the lot had been sheared away, the clean, minimalist lines of the house now ending in a jagged cliff of mud and debris. And there, tangled in the roots of an upended, broken tree, was something dark, something wrapped and unnatural. She knew in that instant what it was. Her vigil was over. The call came 2 hours later. It wasn't her supervisor. It wasn't a familiar detective from the local precinct. The voice on the other end was crisp, professional, and unknown. Is this Eliza Vance? Yes. My name is Detective Isabella Rossi, State Bureau of Investigation. I understand you are the caseworker for a child named Jordan Clark. The name, spoken aloud by a law enforcement officer after a year of silence, was a physical shock. Eliza had to sit down. Yes, I was. A cleanup crew found something at the Clark residence this morning, Rossi said, her voice devoid of emotion. Human remains. Small. Consistent with that of child. I'm looking at the original case file. It says the boy was a runaway, abducted by his birth mother. It says the case is closed. There was a pause. I have a feeling you don't agree with that assessment. A sound escaped Eliza's throat, a half sob, half laugh of pure, unadulterated vindication. No, she said, her voice shaking. No, I do not. My office. 1 hour, Rossi said, and gave her the address. Eliza moved like an automaton. She went to the locked drawer and retrieved the manila folder. Jordan. It felt heavy in her hands, a year of silent, lonely work. She drove through the storm-ravaged city, her mind strangely calm. The rage, the guilt, the frustration that had been her constant companions for a year had receded, replaced by a cold, clear sense of purpose. Detective Rossi's office was spare, functional, and intimidating. Rossi herself was in her late 30s, with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. Talk, she said, gesturing to the chair opposite her desk. And so Eliza talked. The story she had held inside for a year poured out of her, not as a torrent of emotion, but as a calm, chronological account. She spoke of the Clarks' perfect image, of Michael's manipulative use of therapy speak, of the inconsistencies in their story. She described the stage scene in Jordan's bedroom, the convenient disappearance of his birth mother, the way the system had closed ranks to protect a prominent family. She laid it all out, a precise and damning indictment. When she was finished, she opened the folder and laid its contents on Rossi's desk. Her timeline, her notes, her failed searches for Charisse Powell, her log of the monthly drives past the house, including the date she had noted the planting of the Japanese maple tree. Rossi listened without interruption, her eyes fixed on Eliza's face. When Eliza was done, the detective was silent for a long moment, her gaze dropping to the papers on her desk. She picked up the photo of Jordan that Eliza had kept, the one from his intake file. You've been carrying this by yourself for a year, Rossi said. It wasn't a question. No one would listen, Eliza said, her voice quiet. Rossi looked at her, and for the first time, Eliza saw something beyond the professional mask, a flicker of respect, of shared anger. Well, Detective Rossi said, her voice hard as iron. I'm listening now. She picked up her phone and dialed. Get a warrant for the Clark residence. Full forensics. And give me David and Michael Clark. I don't care where they are or who they're with. Find them. Bring them in. Separately. Eliza watched, her body trembling with the release of a pressure she hadn't even realized she was holding. The earth had given up its dead. The silence had been broken. And the unearthing had finally, truly begun. The collapse of the Clark's world was as swift and total as the landslide that had precipitated it. Faced with the undeniable reality of their son's body unearthed from their own yard, and confronted by a state detective armed with Eliza's meticulously documented suspicions, their carefully constructed narrative disintegrated. Separated and interrogated by Rossi's team, their stories fractured. Michael, the therapist, tried to maintain the performance, weeping and expressing shocked disbelief. David, the architect, remained cold, silent, and logical, his composure cracking only when Rossi presented him with Eliza's logbook, which pinpointed the installation of a Japanese maple to within a week of Jordan's disappearance. The evidence was overwhelming. Forensic analysis of the soil around the burial site matched soil found on a pair of shovels in their garden shed. Bruises on the boys' remains were consistent with being violently restrained. The official cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma to the head. The city that had once pitted them now turned on them with a righteous fury. The media narrative shifted overnight from a tragedy of parental abduction to a horror story of monstrous betrayal. The Clarks were no longer the grieving fathers. They were the monster dads, their perfect house the house of horrors. Their faces, once smiling from the society pages, were now grim and haggard in mugshots splashed across every news channel and website. Eliza watched it all from a distance, a key witness, but a peripheral player in the legal maelstrom that followed. She gave her official, videotaped statement, walking Rossi's team through every detail of her file. She felt a grim satisfaction, a sense of a terrible duty finally discharged. She had been right. The truth, the ugly, horrifying truth she had carried alone, was now out in the open. She braced herself for the trial, for the moment when she would have to face them in court, to look them in the eye and testify to their lies. But that moment never came. The system, the same one that had so readily accepted their initial story, began to reassert itself, its gears grinding in favor of the privileged. The Clarks, out on a multi-million-dollar bail bond, hired the best defense attorneys in the state. A new narrative began to emerge, seeded to the press through strategic leaks and off-the-record briefings. It was a story not of murder, but of a tragic accident during a well-intentioned but misguided therapeutic intervention. They admitted to the cover-up, framing it as a moment of pure, understandable panic. But the death itself, they claimed, was not their fault. Their lawyers painted a picture of Jordan not as a victim, but as a severely disturbed and violent child. They used Michael's own professional notes, the ones he had created to justify their abuse, as evidence. They argued that their attempts to restrain Jordan were to protect him from harming himself, and that his death was a terrible, unforeseen consequence. The district attorney, a man with political ambitions, saw a long, messy, and expensive trial ahead. The defense offered a deal. The Clarks would plead guilty to manslaughter and tampering with evidence. They would avoid a murder trial. When Detective Rossi called Eliza to tell her, her voice was flat, devoid of the fire Eliza had heard before. It was the voice of a professional who had just lost a battle she knew she should have won. "They're taking it, Eliza," Rossi said, the disgust evident in her tone. "The DA is taking the deal. Manslaughter. They'll be out in 7 to 10. Maybe less, with good behavior." Eliza stood in her small kitchen, the phone pressed to her ear, and felt nothing. Not rage, not surprise. Just a hollow, empty ache. The truth had been unearthed, but justice was being reburied under a mountain of legal maneuvering. The system had protected its own, even in disgrace. They had tortured and killed a child, buried him in their yard, and lied for a year, and they would not even be called murderers. "The law isn't always about what's right, Eliza," Rossi said, a weary resignation in her voice. "It's about what's provable, and what's palatable. A jury might have believed their story. The story of 2 good men and 1 bad kid. It's a story people are comfortable with." The Clarks were sentenced on a gray Tuesday in November. They stood before the judge, dressed in sober, expensive suits, and read from prepared statements, their voices thick with practiced remorse. They apologized to the court, to the community, to the memory of the son they had failed. It was their final, most convincing performance. Eliza didn't go. She couldn't. Instead, she drove. She took the familiar route up into the hills, one last time. A real estate sign was already posted in front of the house on Crestview Drive. Sold. A new family would move in, drawn by the clean lines and the breathtaking views. They would plant new trees, create new memories, and the story of what happened there would eventually fade into a piece of dark local lore. She parked her car down the street and got out. She walked to the edge of the property, to the place where the yellow police tape had once been. The landslide had been mostly repaired, the hillside regraded and stabilized, but a raw, muddy scar remained on the landscape. It was the spot where the Japanese maple had been, the spot where Jordan had been laid to rest. She stood there for a long time, the cold wind whipping at her coat. She thought of the boy's watchful eyes, of his small body standing in that vast, white room. She thought of her own signature on the adoption decree, the hopeful flourish of her pen. She had believed she was giving him a new life, a renovation of the spirit. She had been wrong. The Clarks were the ones who had been renovating all along. They had tried to patch the empty space in their lives with a child, and when he hadn't fit, when his messy, human reality had threatened to crack their perfect facade, they had simply disposed of him. He was a flawed design element, a detail that had to be corrected. Looking at that ugly patch of mud, the wound in the earth that mirrored the wound in her own soul, the final, terrible truth settled into place, clear and sharp as a shard of glass. He wasn't a runaway. He was a renovation.